Hey folks, I'm back with round 8 from the Minnesota GM Norm round robin tournament. In this round, I was paired against International Master Aleksandr Ostrovskiy, really strong player out of New York. And so Alex actually needed 2 out of 2 to get a GM Norm. I think at this point he had 4.5 points out of 7. And so he would need to win this game and then the next game to get his GM Norm. Well, I was playing black, which is totally fine. I was actually kind of happy to be black because, I wouldn't really have to do anything. I know he's going to try to play for a win and create an interesting game. With white, it would be a little bit awkward because you might want to play a little bit more solid, knowing that your opponent has to try to beat you, which is not always the most sportsmanlike, but it is a thing players can do. But with black, I have no worries. I'm sure he's gonna try to fight for a win. Okay, so I decided to play a solid system, just e4, e5, knight c6. He goes for the Italian game. I played bishop c5 here, castles d6. And pretty quickly we transpose into one of the main lines these days in the Italian game. He played d3. I decided to go h6 here. I think this is one of many reasonable ways to play the position. If I was to castle, then I think Alex likes this line to play with bishop g5, which I wasn't too familiar with and didn't really want to play on this day. So I decided to start with h6. I think it's just a useful idea for players who play this stuff because you get to avoid all of the bishop g5 lines and kind of save yourself a lot of issues. So here I decided to castle, knight d2, a6. Pretty typical move. a5 is also an option in these positions, and nowadays there are many different ways to play this for black, and it seems like black is almost spoiled for choice. But personally, I like a6 here. Not giving up the b5 square and just planning to put the bishop on a7. Now Alex played a4, and this is, I think, one of the more challenging ways for white to approach the Italian game nowadays. And the idea is basically just to try to gain a lot of space on the queen side. One day white wants to push b4, and then maybe even b5 at some point might be uncomfortable for black because this knight will have to move away from c6. Okay, so bishop a7. White goes h3, another useful move, rook e8, and my idea here is simply to play bishop e6 and trade the light squared bishops and actually take with the rook. My understanding of this position is that if black plays bishop e6 here, I mean, a lot of times it's very hard to judge this thing, but I believe in this type of position, the double pawns are not that weak, but if white is able to get a lot of space and get to play against these double pawns, then this might be a little bit uncomfortable for black because the queen comes to b3. At some point white tries to get d4 and maybe has to, let's say, play knight c4, bishop e3, and then can one day play d4, and then b5 is always a concern, and so I think black is under a little bit of pressure in this type of position. So for that reason I start with rook e8. I want to take with the rook on e6, not spoil my structure. White goes b4, bishop e6, takes, rook takes, and queen c2. So yeah, I wasn't too familiar with this position, and I was kind of already on my own here. Apparently queen d7 is the way to go, which is a very natural move. Black's next idea is probably to play d5, and then the rook can come in with rook d8 or rook ae8. Rook d6 is also a possibility at some point. And this is actually, I think, just a very solid position for black, good chances to equalize. In the game, I didn't really see what was wrong with just playing the immediate d5, so I decided to do this. But I think it is a little bit less accurate than the main line. The main reason, I think, is that after queen d7, white doesn't have a lot of useful moves here. Maybe he goes bishop b2, but this is also kind of committal. I think knight f1 is kind of the most natural move, and now d5 is under better circumstances. In the game, I started with d5, and white hasn't committed the knight to f1 yet, so instead Alex played knight b3. And this makes a lot of sense because now that I've committed to d5, I've given up the c5 square, and this knight might be able to use this square, mainly after first trading the dark square bishops off, and then knight c5 is actually going to be kind of a nice square for that piece. So I realized I might be under some pressure here already, because white's plan of bishop e3 and then bringing the knight to c5 looks really annoying. I'm going to have a rook hit on e6, the b7 pawn is hanging. I also still have to be careful about b5 pushes. After some thought, I decided to go for this pretty common maneuver with knight e7. I think this was still a good choice. My idea is to bring the knight to g6, where it can still defend the e5 pawn. It's threatening maybe to go to f4 in some cases, especially if we trade dark square bishops. And I'm just not getting hit with this constant b5 in every move. So I felt like this was kind of the most useful thing I can do. Bishop e3, and I just continued knight g6. I actually think this move makes sense, even though it allows white to take on a7 and misplace my rook. The main reason I decided to do it in this way is I figured if I take on e3 first, then knight g6 is not so good, because the immediate knight c5 is just really problematic for black. The only way to defend is to go rook b6, and I kind of just stopped my calculation here, because this is already just looks extremely awkward, and white has a lot of ideas, for example knight d2, knight c4, or simply just defending the b pawn and playing like a5, c4, and yeah, the rook is just very, very badly placed on b6. So instead of knight g6, in a position like this, black would have to play b6, and I think technically this was still okay for black. The engine doesn't think it's that bad. During the game I thought after a5 white has a little bit of pressure, but it's probably not that much better for white, and black is doing alright. So this was definitely playable, but okay, I decided to go for knight g6. White trades on a7, rook takes a7, and my point here was that now knight c5 doesn't come with a double attack, so I can just move my rook maybe to d6 or back to e8. I think I was probably going to play rook d6 here. And then when I play b6, I'll be able to kind of kick white's knight out of c5, and eventually I'll just spend a move to bring my rook back to a8, and hopefully be able to equalize the position. Maybe I can go like b6, a5, and just kind of secure the queen side. So yeah, it felt a little bit risky, because, you know, I'm really misplacing my rook quite badly for maybe one or two moves, but I figure, okay, as long as concretely white isn't able to create any kind of real pressure in time, then I should be able to one day bring the rook back into the game and equalize. So really it's a matter of move by move calculation. Or let's say move by move analysis. Okay, so here he decided to play rook d1. I went rook d6 and knight d2. And I thought this was a really interesting move, because now white is potentially wanting to play knight c4. Then after rook takes d1, he's able to take over the file, and potentially I thought, okay, black is certainly in danger of being worse here. I ended up coming up with this move, queen e8, which I think was a pretty nice defensive resource. The point here is that after knight to c4, rook takes d1. If queen takes d1, then the e4 pawn is hanging, and I don't think white gets anything there. And if rook takes d1, then I can potentially take the a4 pawn, and I think white gets some compensation here with rook d8 check, because here we can see the problem with black having the rook on a7. But I wasn't quite sure what to make of this position, and I felt like, again, if white is not in time to pose some problems, then black will play b6, maybe queen c6, rook a8, bring the rook back into the game, or maybe try to play a5 somewhere, and could be all right. So objectively, I'm not sure how white is doing here. But as a second option, I think I could also play a move like either b6 here, or maybe rook a8 first, and then followed by b6 to control the knight, and then playing rook d8 and just kind of slowly equalizing. Probably white can still put some pressure, but it's not so easy, because I do have a little bit of pressure against e4. A move like queen d3 is typically met with knight f4, so it's not so easy for white to get much in this position. Okay, so instead white decided to play knight a5, so keeping more pieces on the board. I pushed b6. Apparently Stockfish likes b5 here, which was kind of surprising to me, because it looks like it gives up a lot of squares. But the engine doesn't really care. Black can maybe play c6 soon and actually bring the rook back into the game via d7, and yeah, is just kind of holding. But okay, I thought b6 was a little bit more natural. Knight c4. I dropped the rook back to d8. And here white played knight f1. And at this point I started feeling very comfortable because I felt like, well, minimum I can either trade first and bring my rook back to a8, or what I did in the game, I just brought the rook back immediately. And now I just felt like there's no reason black should be worse here, because I haven't made any weaknesses yet. I'm fighting for the d-file just as much, and both of my knights are reasonably placed. So basically I felt like I was almost equalizing here, if not already equal. White played knight ce3, and here I think black has a lot of options. I felt like his idea is maybe to play either knight f5 or knight d5, but both of these moves aren't too scary for black here. Like knight f5, I think usually black can just play knight e7 here and offer to trade the knight, or white will have to go back. I decided to play a5. I thought this was kind of a useful move for me in terms of the structure. Now white has to potentially think about me taking on b4 and maybe targeting the a4 pawn, or if white pushes the b pawn or trades on a5, then white is going to be giving up the c5 square. So especially b5 would allow like knight d7, knight c5, and that could be very unpleasant for white in the long run. So I thought this was a good move to kind of put a little bit of positional pressure. Actually, at this point, my opponent was definitely approaching time trouble. I think he had maybe, under 10 minutes, maybe even closer to 5 minutes, with just the 30-second increment, like no second time control. Because he burned a lot of time just trying to, be able to find some advantage for white, create some pressure, but there wasn't a whole lot in the position, and just couldn't find anything, and this was what we got. So here I was actually already feeling a little bit optimistic, even because I think the position is very close to equal, but I had a lot more time on the clock, and usually that's a nice situation to be in. Okay, so here I decided to take on d5, e takes d5, and I played queen e7. And the structure has kind of changed a little bit, like we've traded these knights on d5. I personally felt like it's definitely not a big deal. In fact, it's probably just kind of nice for black. There's still some pressure against this b4 pawn, and now I actually have a majority in the center, which is kind of nice. So one day these pawns might be able to come forward, like e4, f5, and maybe knight e5, and so on, and black could get some real play on the king side. So he goes knight e3, and it seems like the line white is kind of inviting is for black to take the pawn on b4, then he takes on c7, and I looked at this a little bit, but yeah, ultimately I felt like white should be at least okay here, maybe even doing well. His d pawn is now a pass pawn, might be strong. The knight on e3 is definitely well placed, and yeah, I wasn't really sure here if black is equal or not. I think instead what I did was probably better. I just played knight f4. So not trying to force anything, just improving my knight. And it's actually not easy for white to find good moves here, because I do have some pressure against the b pawn. b5 is really not what he wants to do, because then he's really just giving up the c5 square. And b takes a5 is kind of the same thing. Rook takes a5, and structurally, like, black is doing very well here. And yeah, d5 pawn is weak, a4 pawn is weak, and so on. Okay, so he ends up going king h2. I think just useful move. Maybe he can play g3 at some point without having to worry about the pawn. And I decided to push forward with e4. And I think this was the correct decision. Now I'm fighting for the d3 square for my knight, which is a really strong square, and I can support the pawn one day, maybe with like queen e5 and then f5. And if I can get that in, then I feel like my position might start rolling very, very quickly, maybe even f4 at some point. So he goes rook d4. Hitting the pawn, also defending b4. I saw no reason not to play knight d3. Now I'm threatening to take twice on b4 and take with the knight, as well as actually maybe even bigger threat, take, and queen e5 check, picking up the rook. So finally he felt like he couldn't really wait any longer, and he pushes b5. So yeah, I definitely felt like this was a very nice achievement. So I did think my knight on d3 was a little bit unstable, and I didn't want to deal with any kind of like f3 breaks. So I played this move rook e8. Now I think f3 is extremely risky, because maybe black can take or give queen e5 check first, knight f4 at some point. The knight will get out, and there will be a lot of a lot of danger against white's king. Maybe even queen g5 is a possible move as well. So after rook e8, he goes king g1, rook a d8, and he played rook d1, queen g5. I thought this was all pretty natural. Now, if allowed, I just want to play f5, f4, or knight f4, and yeah, I think white's situation is actually pretty serious here. Maybe even knight e5 and threatening knight f3 check, because it just looks like black has a really dangerous kingside attack. So white took a practical decision here. He decides to just sacrifice the exchange, just hacking off the knight. Rook takes d3, takes, queen takes. And yeah, I think this was just a very good practical decision, especially because he was really running low on time at this point, and this simplifies the position. It makes things a lot easier for white. Now he has just a very solid position, very solid knight on e3, solid grip in the center and on the queen side. He's got one pawn for the exchange, which is nice. But most importantly, it's hard to find targets now for black. Now there's very little I can really do on the king side. My rooks aren't really attacking much. So, we have to prefer black here. I mean, black has to be slightly better because white doesn't really have enough for the exchange. There's not like this active plan. If white could still somehow break through with c4 and c5, that would be nice, but it seems kind of unlikely. So white doesn't really have more than a fortress here, but still, from black's point of view, it's hard to play when you don't have like active moves. Basically, black has to just be super patient here and hope white allows them to get some activity. Okay, so I think the easiest way to, let's say, just get a safe position where maybe black can try to play on, but it would be very, very hard to try to squeeze anything from here, just to play queen g6 and offer this endgame. If white does take on g6, I think black is slightly better here, but it's would be very, very difficult to win, and I think in a practical game, white is probably going to be holding here most of the time, and it's not like black can just press for free. I mean, black does have to be careful not to allow a lot of counterplay, in which case there are many scenarios where white could end up better here. But okay, objectively, I think this position was pretty safe. I decided to play rook e7 here, and this was kind of based on a miscalculation that I ended up just further miscalculating. So here, this kind of allows white to play rook to g4, and then after the move queen f6, which I did not end up playing because it seems like white has this move knight f5, which originally I thought was not working, but then once I started looking at it a little bit more, I thought maybe it actually is working and something to be afraid of, and then I ended up avoiding it, but probably not for the right reasons. So the main line I calculated here was like rook e1 check, king h2, and to go queen e5. Because now g7 is hanging and it's not clear how to defend it. g6 seems to hang the h6 pawn. There's just no way to defend g7. So yeah, I was just looking for, like, let's say the active moves first. Then after queen e5, f4, yeah, I simply just couldn't find a really good move here. Yeah, maybe queen e4 is possible, but again, this allows rook takes g7 with check, and it just felt extremely unclear to me. Maybe this is also fine for black. But in fact, black had a couple of solutions here. Number one, g6 was actually quite playable, because after knight takes h6 check, either king h7 or king g7, white actually loses a lot of the coordination between his pieces here. I mean, he can still give, let's say, knight f5 check, then it could transpose to the line, but black could also play king f8. Now the knight has to go back somewhere, and as soon as the knight moves, black is taking on f2. So just for example, like now white doesn't have any initiative, and black's queen and rook are just winning the game. So yeah, so rook e1 check, king h2, g6, and yeah, basically when I was revisiting this position, all of a sudden I thought, like, oh, white has a lot of play. I think I just kind of assumed, like, white can take the pawn, and if I'm losing a pawn with check, then the line is not worth going for. But yeah, that was a very, very superficial analysis. I really should have just kind of looked a little bit deeper and seen that, like, even after king h7, for example, not allowing the knight to come back to f5, this position also is very difficult for white to play, because now, white's knight is kind of loose. I think the only move is to play like queen d2 to defend the knight. Black can go rook d8, and optically this position is very, very different from the one we were looking at, because here white has kind of lost all coordination. Black's pieces are extremely active. There's tons of targets in the position. Like now all of white's pawns seem pretty weak. Rook e2 is a big idea. And so yeah, so this clearly just feels very, very difficult for white to play. Even if objectively white has some kind of miracle save here, it's clearly much easier for black to play this position. The other option actually after knight f5, rook e1 check, king h2 was for black to just go king f8. Now this one was a little bit harder to recognize. I actually considered the move, I just didn't really think it was working, to be honest. Like rook takes g7 for example, rook e5, and it turns out white just has no follow-up. The knight on f5 is hanging, the rook on g7 is hanging. g4 is not helping because black will just take on f5 and take the rook. Yeah, this trick with like rook g8 and queen g3 is also not working after pretty much any move. So yeah, it turns out there was not a whole lot to fear here, and so during the game it's like I miscalculated twice. At first I thought rook e7, I thought rook g4, knight f5 is like absolutely not working. Then I realized no, it actually is. It is kind of a serious idea. But then once we got to this position over the board, I suddenly couldn't figure out after queen f6, knight f5 that black is actually surviving and is doing totally fine. So all of a sudden I felt like I needed to bail out. So I spent some time in this position looking for alternatives. Queen h5 I think I did not like for basically the same reason. I thought knight f5 is still very awkward to meet. And eventually I decided just to bail out and give back the exchange with rook takes e3, which is a bit of a regretful decision, but okay, it does make sense. If you think you're losing after queen f6, knight f5, or at least giving up too much counterplay, then yeah, once you get to this position, you do have to figure out a way to make sure you don't lose the game. So I decided to sacrifice the exchange back on e3. Now white can either take with the queen or with the pawn. If he takes with the queen, then after, let's say, queen takes e3, takes, and rook takes d5, I think black is basically totally fine. The rook can just sit on d7, or it can come to c5 or e5, and yeah, white has a lot of weaknesses in their position too, so basically black should hold this one. So white decided to play f takes e3 here, which I think keeps more chances alive. Now it's very important not to blunder with queen takes d5 here, because after rook d4, white is just winning on the spot. The rook on d8 is hanging. But instead black has the move rook takes d5. A nice kind of counterattack. Rook d4 was played. Again, I think this is the only way to keep any kind of chances alive. Rook takes d4, e takes d4. And yeah, all of a sudden we reach this queen endgame with equal pawns. It feels like white is a little bit better because he has the potential to make a pass pawn on the queen side, which are usually stronger in queen and pawn endgames. On the other hand, for black, it's hard to push the pawns forward because this always allows a lot of checks and the king has to open up. But objectively, the position is just very, very close to drawn. It's very, very equal, mainly because it's hard for white to make progress. It's hard to create a pass pawn. And because white is missing a pawn on the king side, it's much easier for black to give a lot of annoying checks. And so black has a lot of ideas of giving a perpetual in this type of position. White could have also played c takes d4 back here and gone for this structure, but I don't think the evaluation will really change. White's pawns are just kind of too weak to keep advancing, and yeah, it'll be very difficult for white to safely create a pass pawn and create any kind of winning chances here. Here, black's king is also close enough just to kind of hang out in the center and defend against any pawn pushes. Okay, so after e takes d4, I decided to start with g6, just kind of improving the position of my king. White played queen c4, hitting the pawn. Now queen f4 I think would have been perfectly sensible, just defending the pawn on c7, keeping the queen really active, and keeping all possibilities open of giving either queen c1 or queen e3, and just trying to deliver an immediate perpetual. But actually I calculated a little bit here and I realized the immediate queen c1 check is basically working just fine for black, and should be at least a perpetual there. So I calculated for a bit, and I just saw no reason not to play it. At this point, I mean, I definitely didn't think I was at all better. I thought, only black can really be worse here, so I was certainly comfortable with just trying to shut down the game and force a draw, which maybe wasn't the best mindset, though objectively, yeah, only black can be worse. So queen c1 check, he goes king f2, I played queen d2 check, he comes up king f3. I mean, he's still trying to win the game, so he has to try to get out of the checks. Queen e2 doesn't work simply because I can just take on c3, and black is totally fine. So he tries king f3, and I played queen d1 check, and now white has a big choice. If he goes king f4, what I realize is that the king just can't get very far, because once the king gets to e5, then both e6 and d6 are covered, and it's hard to advance. So, for example, after a move like, let's say, queen d2 check, already it's difficult for white to keep going. Like king e5, black can go queen g5 check, and the king can't advance. Next, we're taking the g2 pawn with check, and then black 100% starts playing for the win, because now black is going to be up a pawn, maybe 2 pawns, and white still hasn't made any progress. So this would probably just be good for black. Instead, after queen d2 check, white would have to just go back, king f3, and then we likely should get a repetition. Another option after queen d1 check would be to play queen e2, and yeah, during the game I was very unclear about the evaluation of this king and pawn endgame. I thought it is likely a draw, because black is going to get the king to d6, white will play c4, maybe black plays f5, and it felt like neither king is going to be able to make much progress, but I really wasn't sure. Fortunately, I realized that after queen e2, I probably have a safer option than just playing queen takes a4. Just grabbing the pawn, white probably goes queen e8 check, and can win the pawn back, queen e5 check. Let's say king goes to g8, queen takes c7. But here black has queen takes b5, and because black is threatening to start giving a lot of checks with queen d3 check, and the fact that black has their own passed pawn now that can be really strong in this type of position, basically black is doing totally fine here, and I think white has to be careful not to over push the position, because the a pawn could become extremely dangerous very quickly. So yeah, actually at this point I felt like I should be holding the draw quite easily. Alex decided to repeat once with the move king f2. And then here something, yeah, really kind of strange happened, because of course I could just repeat the position we just had with queen d2 check. Basically, 2 moves ago, it was like the game went queen c1, king f2, queen d2 check, king f3, queen d1, king f2, and queen d2 would just be repeating the position. But then I just kind of overthought things, and I actually felt like maybe queen c2 check is a better way to, let's say, secure the perpetual. I have a hard time explaining why I thought this move was so much more accurate. I think after queen d2 check, Oh, I think what I wanted was after queen c2 check, king f3 was the option to play queen f5 check. I basically just thought this was a cleaner perpetual. Like, now I don't have to calculate any lines with the king coming forward. I just play queen f5 check. If king g3, I have queen g5 check, and if the king goes back, then basically we're repeating the position from before, and white hasn't made any progress. If the king goes to e2, then I just have queen c2 check, and again, we have a pretty simple perpetual. And if king e3, we have queen g5 check, and again, we're kind of staying on the circuit. Looking at it now, it was totally unnecessary, because that's not much easier than just playing queen d2 check and just repeating the position. And I mean, the lines that I already showed with the king not being able to come up to f4 because of queen d2 and queen g5 ideas, I mean, I had already seen these lines, and so I'd already realized that there's no danger here for black. So yeah, it was very strange of me to kind of not repeat the position, even though I'm playing for a draw, and try to improve on the defense, because probably by okay, by now some of you have already noticed that after queen c2 check, white has the second option to play king g3, which I just completely forgot about, to be honest. And all of a sudden, black no longer has any good checks, and things get even worse. Black's queen has no way of getting back to defend the c7 pawn, which is absolutely critical. So if I could just play a move like queen d7 here, queen d8, basically any move to defend the pawn, queen e7, the position would still be completely drawn. But because my queen is now stranded, black is actually just immediately losing, which is very, very unfortunate. Because now white is going to be taking the pawn on c7 and immediately putting the queen kind of on the best diagonal, covering any potential checks to the king. So I don't have any chances for a perpetual. Immediately creating a very strong pass d pawn, and also just ruining black's defense on the queen side, because now b6 and a5 are both hanging a lot. So yeah, all of a sudden black is basically just lost there. I mean, the key difference is that after queen d2 check, if white had played king g3, which does keep the game going at least a little bit. Here, of course, white has queen e3 check, or black has queen e3 check and queen f4, and going back to that original perpetual. The only way white could try to continue the game is to again play king f3. Black would go queen d1 check and king g3 in this position. Here, the only good check black has is queen e1 check. White can go king h2. And now it seems like, again, actually, black's queen doesn't have any good checks, but at least the queen can drop back to e7, and this position is, again, totally equal. White hasn't made any progress. Black is just going to defend the pawn, keep the king steady, and at a certain point is always ready to activate the queen and try to deliver the perpetual if white's queen leaves the defense. So yeah, this was a really, really strange blunder, and yeah, I can't use the clock as an excuse because I had at least like 15, 16 minutes left at this point, so plenty of time to double check and triple check my calculations and just make sure I wasn't overlooking any obvious moves. So yeah, I mean, really just kind of a bad blunder by me. Probably the worst move I played in like all three of my my recent tournaments, because it's just like a one move blunder. And then, yeah, I spent, basically all my time afterwards just trying to figure out what to do, but I realized pretty quickly that, well, after king g3, there's not even a way to keep the game interesting. Okay, black can go queen c1 here, looking for some checks, but again, after queen takes c7, queen e3 check, king h2, white has this critical diagonal under control, and black is basically just completely lost. I mean, it's really just kind of bad luck. Like, white's queen on c7 ends up defending the only weakness, defending the key diagonal, hitting all of my pawns, and also supporting the pass d pawn. I mean, it's really just absolutely perfectly placed. So I played just a few more moves here, but the game was no longer in doubt. I played king g7, white took on c7, I took on a4, queen takes b6, white is in time to take a second pawn, and now I get this past a pawn, but it's simply too slow because white's b pawn I think is simply faster, and it's also very hard for black to push the pawn forward, because if the king leaves the a file, then white can simply take the pawn and defend the c3 pawn, and I don't have any good ways of getting my queen back to checking distance. So for example, if I go queen d1 here, white can take on a5, and I have one check with queen d3, king h2, but black runs out of checks. Next move, white goes queen c7, everything is covered, and the b pawn or the d pawn will just win the game. So yeah, unfortunately in this position I just don't have a good move. The only way to move my queen and keep the a pawn protected is to block it with either queen a3 or queen a1. But yeah, here it's like my pawn is just moving extremely slow, because now I'm going to need an extra tempo to get my queen out of the way. So after Alex played the move queen c7, I decided it was time to resign here, actually, because concretely, actually very similar to my game against Andrew Hong from previous round 3, where white's b pawn is just smooth sailing and promoting, black's a pawn is way too slow, and of course white is always going to win with promoting and queen e5 check, and basically it's a hopeless situation for black. So yeah, really unfortunate game. It kind of spoiled my tournament for me. I think had I held this game, then I really could consider the tournament to be pretty reasonable. because it would have put me on an even score after 8 rounds. And yeah, I mean, my goal for the tournament was to score at least even, which I felt like would be a good score against the group of participants. So yeah, losing this game was a little bit unfortunate, but yeah, what can you do? Sometimes you're just gonna blunder terribly, and it's gonna happen once every couple hundred games or something, or a couple dozen games. So all you can do is just take it in stride, and yeah, it doesn't really change much. Still a bunch of games left to play in this in the next tournament. So I just try to absorb it and forget about it as quickly as I could. All right, so I had one more round left in this tournament, and I'll be covering that in the next video. So I'll see you there.